This subcommittee has broken much new ground. Today is another first. This is the first ever congressional hearing on crimes against humanity. For generations, the United States has led the struggle for human rights around the world. Over 50 years before Nuremberg, George Washington Williams, an African-American minister, lawyer, and historian, called for an international commission to investigate crimes against humanity in the Congo, which was then ruled by Belgium's King Leopold II. Under Leopold's iron fist, Congo's population was reduced by half, with up to 10 million people losing their lives. In a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Williams decried the, quote, crimes against humanity perpetrated by King Leopold's regime. And those who are interested in this touching story should read King Leopold's Ghost, which is a great book I recommend. Over 50 years later, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States led the first prosecutions for crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trials. The promise of Nuremberg is that the perpetrators of mass atrocities will be held accountable for their actions. As we have in previous meetings, I'm going to preface this meeting with a short video to provide some context for our discussion of the accountability for crimes against humanity and historical U.S. support for holding perpetrators of these crimes accountable. Please. Crimes against humanity are acts of murder, enslavement, torture, rape, extermination, ethnic cleansing, or arbitrary detention committed as part of a widespread systematic attack directed against a civilian population. With far too few exceptions, we have failed to prevent and stop these crimes. The promise of Nuremberg remains unfulfilled. We've seen this most clearly in Darfur and Western Sudan. In this region of 6 million people, hundreds of thousands have been killed. As many as 2.5 million have been driven from their homes. There is much that must be done to end this carnage in Darfur. Part of the solution is arresting and prosecuting the perpetrators. Otherwise, they will continue to act with impunity, and victims will still feel they have no recourse but to resort to violence themselves. For several years, both Democrats and Republicans have criticized the Bush administration for failing to stop the genocide in Darfur, and I'm sure our witnesses today will urge the administration to do more. But we should give credit where it is due, and I especially want to commend President Bush for supporting efforts to prosecute the perpetrators of crimes against humanity in Darfur. I've had several personal conversations with President Bush about this issue, and I know that he really feels in his heart, as many of us do, that we have a special obligation in this situation. Let me be frank, the International Criminal Court is still a source of controversy on Capitol Hill, but the administration and their allies have set aside their concerns because of the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, and they should be commended for doing so. Recently, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, reported to the UN Security Council that massive atrocities are ongoing and that, quote, the entire Darfur region is a crime scene. In the meantime, the Sudanese government has put Ahmad Haroun, who was indicted by the court for committing crimes against humanity, in a high-ranking position where he can continue to threaten victims of the violence in Darfur and humanitarian workers. That is an outrage. Following Mr. Moreno Ocampo's most recent report to the Security Council, Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, said that the United States government, quote, strongly believes that those responsible for acts of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur must be held accountable and be brought to justice. The administration is right. We owe it to the victims in Darfur to ensure that those who have perpetrated these horrific crimes are held accountable. But it is not only Darfur that is a safe haven for perpetrators of crimes against humanity. Sadly, it is also our own country. This subcommittee's first bill, which became law in December 2007, closed the loophole in the U.S. law that made our country a safe haven for perpetrators of genocide. But despite long-standing U.S. support for prosecution of crimes against humanity perpetrated in World War II, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and Sierra Leone, among other places, there is no U.S. law prohibiting crimes against humanity. As a result, the U.S. government is unable to prosecute perpetrators of crimes against humanity found in our own country. In contrast, other grave human rights violations, including genocide and torture, are crimes under U.S. law. This loophole has real consequences. During our recent hearing on rape as a weapon of war, we discussed the fact that if a foreign warlord who engaged in mass rape came to the United States, he would be beyond the reach of our law. And during our oversight hearing on the U.S. government's enforcement of human rights laws, we learned about the case of Marko Boskic, who allegedly participated in the Srebrenica massacre in the Bosnian conflict and still found safe haven in Massachusetts. Because of the gap in our laws, Boskic was charged with visa fraud rather than crimes against humanity. Upon learning this, Emina Hidic, whose two brothers were among the estimated 7,000 men and boys killed in Srebrenica, said that they should condemn him for the crime. By signaling to perpetrators of genocide that they'll not find a safe haven in the United States, the Genocide Accountability Act moved us a little closer to fulfilling our pledge of never again. We should take the next step and make sure that those who commit crimes against humanity cannot escape accountability in America. But we must go further and ensure the perpetrators of crimes against humanity cannot escape accountability anywhere in the civilized world. Only then will the promise of Nuremberg be fulfilled. I'm honored that Senator Specter has joined us today, and I would invite him, if he'd like to make an opening comment at this time, to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this important hearing for the Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law. I had not planned to be in attendance, but the ranking member of the subcommittee could not be here, so I wanted to come and indicate my view of the importance of this hearing. Regrettably, senators are very busy, and the absence of senators here today does not indicate a lack of very deep concern on the issue, but there are just many other meetings and subcommittee hearings and full committee hearings in process at this time. This issue was one of enormous importance, and all you have to do is talk about 2,450,000 people being displaced and 450,000 people killed, and the atrocities are just overwhelming. The regrettable fact of life is that it's become a way around the world, and perhaps especially in Africa at this time. It's hard to view the scene in Africa without seeing some ruthless dictator, some ruthless political leader using the most horrific tactics to gain power. And genocide, regrettably, has become a common practice. I visited Rwanda in 2002 and have participated, as has the chairman, Senator Durbin, on many, many efforts. And there's a lot of concern in the Congress. There's a lot of concern on the American people. And as we all know, there was a large UN task force supposed to be developed, 26,000 peacekeepers to go to Darfur, but only about a third of them were there, and it took a very, very long time to get there. My sense is that we have to get a lot tougher about it through the International War Crimes Tribunal. That is something that these people will pay attention to. In 2002, 6 years ago, I visited the International War Crimes Tribunal in Tanzania. And there is a man in jail there who was convicted of genocide, the first head of state, a man named Jean Kambanda, who's serving a life sentence for genocide. And that is what we really need to do. We really need to marshal our forces. It is a relatively recent development in international law to hold people like this accountable for crimes against humanity. Relatively recent, War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia. And the United States has been in the forefront, help from the FBI and the CIA and investigative agencies and funding. So I thank the witnesses for coming today. I regret that I cannot stay too long, but this is a very, very important issue, and you see a lot of people behind us. They're the staffers. They're the people who do all the work, write the memos, make sure that the senators know what you said so that there could be appropriate follow-through. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Specter. I appreciate your being here. We're going to turn to our witnesses now. Unfortunately, one of our witnesses, Mia Farrow, had last-minute scheduling difficulties and could not attend. But we are really honored to have four excellent witnesses here today. Let me ask if the witnesses would please stand and raise their right hands to be sworn. You affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Our first witness, Daoud Hari, is the author of a book which I was given yesterday. I'm going to promote your book here. It's entitled The Translator, A Tribesman's Memoir of Darfur. This is an incredible book. It tells the story of Mr. Hari's life in Darfur and of his travels and struggles. I'm halfway through it, and I promise you I will finish it. And I commend you, as I said to you personally before, for some of the beautiful images that you create in a book about a very terrifying and troubling issue in your home country of Sudan and Darfur. I believe that you have extraordinary skills, and I hope that those who feel as intensely about this situation as many of us do will read your words. Mr. Hari was born in the Darfur region of Sudan. After escaping an attack on his village in 2003, he entered the refugee camps in Chad and began serving as translator for major news organizations, including the New York Times, NBC, and BBC. Mr. Hari was captured in Darfur while working with Paul Salopek, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist of the Chicago Tribune and a friend of mine. I didn't know Mr. Hari at the time, but the Chicago Tribune called and asked if I would try to get Mr. Salopek out of jail, so we tried to get you all out of jail, and eventually we did, after more than 30 days of imprisonment. That detention was totally unnecessary, and thankfully all of them were released without serious injury or any other retribution. Following the release, Mr. Hari became the third of reportedly only 5 Darfuris who have been granted refuge in the United States since this crisis began. He is the third of 5. When we talk about 2.5 million displaced and hundreds of thousands killed in this genocide, we have accepted 5 refugees in the United States. He now lives in the Baltimore area and advocates for an end to the conflict in Darfur. Mr. Hari, this issue is personal for you in a way that most of us can't even begin to understand. But I thank you for your courage and for sharing your story, and I look forward to your testimony. Please, your entire statement will be made part of the record, and I invite you to add at this point anything you would like in the time allotted. Please.
Thank you, Chairman Senator Darfur. Thank you for honorable rank member of Congress. I'm very thanks very much for your working to end genocide in Darfur. After 5 years since the crisis began in Darfur, and I will have to thank you again. You let me out from the prison with Paul Salopek. How that's a very hard time we've been for 35 days in prison in Sudan, which is the dictator is very, very hard to be inside the prison on their hand, and how we've been treated in for 35 days. As I'm some of you know me, I'm Daoud Hari from North Darfur. I'm born, my age is 35 years old, and I've been going to school in Sudan and Fashur in North Darfur. And I left Sudan and came back in 2003, the end. What I saw in happening in my people in Darfur, how the people were treating the government troops and the Janjaweed, how the people were killed in Darfur. I stand up to working with the journalists to able to show stories for the journalists a lot. Since I was working as translator in Darfur, in 2004 I working with the U.S. State Department, which we call the CID, which were investigated about the genocide in Darfur. We working only 1 month half. They told us the estimated killing in Darfur at that time, 400,000 people were being killed in Darfur. This is 2004. After they left, I tried to working with the journalists, Paul Salopek and the Chicago Tribune, Nick Christoph, New York Times, the other journalists from UK. And when I was working with the UK journalists, we've been in the place. There is 81 person who've been killed 3 days ago. And when we go over there and we saw the bodies, some of them didn't have even the head. And this mostly the people were being captured by the Janjaweed and the government in the bush. After that, they would kill them through the bushes. So we saw the bodies, some of them mostly 10 years or maybe less than 10 years. The people were dying over there. I saw with Nick Christoph, when I was working with him, we crossed Darfur, we met 2 Janjaweed soldiers who had been captured, child soldiers, 13 years. we've been captured by some the villagers, the vendors, who were trying to kill them, and we interviewed them. And I saw one of him, he'd been shot by the bullet when he's been beating is very hard, and I able to talk to him. The next case were witness. And he showed me there's a money which his governments give to him to come to attack these people. The areas or the village they were attacking is they were neighborhoods. They were being going to school before with those children in the school together, and they have their animals and camels together. After that, the government of Sudan came to tell them, to separate them. They were Arabs and this is non-Arabs, and they have to be to defend themselves before these people coming to killing your people. And they give them some money and they training them for 3 days. After 3 days, the child is 13 years. It's maybe he cannot able to carry the gun. Is mostly the weight of the gun is almost more than 5 or 6 kilos. So he comes and they were felt, and they told us what is happening. The government, how they treat them, and how to give them an idea to come to attack their neighborhood and their friends. After all this, 5 years when I work in, the people who were responsible for those crimes, until now they were free. I appreciate that as a U.S. government and Europe and the international law, they were asking to these responsible for the court one day. But we believe that until now, they were working outside, they were free, and they were happy. They were doing the same crime in Darfur. Just only the last week of the May, there's more than 3,000 people were being captured from the Darfur. Darfuris who were living in Khartoum when this Khartoum is attacked by rebels. And some of them, they were students in school in Khartoum and Omdurman. Just only they were Darfuris. They were being accused by the government, they were helping for the rebels. They never saw even the rebels in their life, and till now they were in the prison. And the government, they treat them and they give them more than 10 or 15 years in the prison. I would like to say thank you for United States and international law. The laws will be longer for us to be coming one day, but I will ask and try to ask international community to stop this genocide and to bring this responsible for the court as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hari. We'll have a few questions after the other witnesses have had a chance to speak. Our second witness, Gail Smith, is co-founder of the Enough Project to End Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Ms. Smith was based in Africa for over 20 years as a journalist covering military, economic, and political affairs for major news organizations, including BBC, Associated Press, Reuters, the Boston Globe, and Financial Times. She served as a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council from 1998 to 2001, Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Agency for International Development from 1994 to 1998. Ms. Smith, thank you again for being here today. Please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much.
Shoot the mic on.
Oh, sorry. Let me thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. I've been in government. I've been a reporter. I'm now here as an advocate. And like the many people behind me, we're really, really appreciative of all you are doing to make sure that the United States is on the right side of history when it comes to genocide and crimes against humanity. And I think as your brief film points out, we've made some progress. We've seen referrals by the United Nations Security Council to the International Criminal Court of the case of Darfur, also of the Democratic Republic of Congo and northern Uganda. Charles Taylor is in custody. There has been an increase in the number of emerging democracies in Africa who are turning over those indicted for genocide in Rwanda. But I think the fact that we're sitting here today as we enter the 6th year of the crisis in Darfur is in large measure because the perpetrators have not been held to account. I think we would all agree that there's a need for a sustained and robust peace process and a desperate need for a viable peacekeeping mission to be deployed to Darfur. But the bottom line is accountability. And if this committee can propose legislation that would in fact make crimes against humanity a violation of U.S. law, I think it would strengthen our ability to enforce accountability around the world and strengthen that chain that we need that allows the perpetrators no way out. Let me just say a couple of things about reasons why this is so important. In the case of Sudan, we have a government that is ruthless, but it is also smart and calculating. They operate on the basis of their own interests. And to this date, they have no reason to believe that there will be any meaningful cost imposed if they continue to perpetrate crimes against humanity against the people of Darfur. Yes, there have been indictments. Yes, the Security Council last week, and importantly, unanimously demanded that they turn the indictees over to the ICC, but they haven't done it, and there is no cost. We've seen with this regime that the only time it acts is when it perceives that there are real costs, whether it's cooperating with the United States in the war on terror, whether it was trying to get out from under multilateral UN sanctions for their complicity in an attempt to assassinate the President of Egypt, or in the case of the peace agreement in southern Sudan. They knew there was a cost, and they knew there was no way out. Right now, they believe, and they have evidence to believe, that they can get away with it. And their victims have the evidence to believe that the international community has abandoned them. So by strengthening that chain of accountability, by amending our laws, I think we send a signal and inform the calculations of the perpetrators, not just in Darfur, but elsewhere. Second, obviously, it's the right thing to do at a time when the United States needs, as it has throughout our history, stand up and champion the right thing to do. I think also it's important that we send a signal as American citizens that we see these crimes not just as abuses of their victims, but as violations of our common humanity. Third, it's in our national interests to do this and to do more across the board on accountability, not least because in so doing, we strengthen the moral foundations from which we lead, but also, quite frankly, for reasons of security. We cannot afford the violence and instability that we see when these crimes occur. Look at Sudan today. It's the largest country in Africa. It is bleeding into Chad and the Central African Republic. The future of generations has been destroyed, and the ability of that country over time to be a stable anchor in the sub-region has been severely compromised. Finally, by making crimes against humanity a violation of U.S. law, we uphold the rule of law, and that, Mr. Chairman, is, quite frankly, the sledgehammer with which we can attack the cycle of impunity. I lived in Sudan for many years. It is a country, I was just talking to Daoud about, that is heartbreaking for many reasons, but perhaps none more than the fact that it is one of the most friendly, generous peoples I have ever lived with, and that is being fundamentally compromised because the rule of law has been abused, has been distorted, has been disobeyed, and the government of Sudan has flouted the will of the international community, the Security Council, the ICC, the government of the United States, and others. I honestly believe if we take this small but very significant step, we can remind them that we will, as the United States, hold them accountable and further strengthen that chain of accountability that we need to make sure that we're not sitting here again a year from now testifying about the crisis in Darfur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Our next witness is Diane Orentlicker, who is professor of law at the Washington College of Law, American University. She's also co-director of the Law School's Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law and was the founding director of its War Crimes Research Office, which she headed up from 1995 through 2004. Professor Orentlicker is currently on leave from the Washington College of Law and serving as special counsel to the Open Society Justice Initiative. Described by the Washington Diplomat as one of the world's leading authorities on war crimes tribunals, Professor Orentlicker has published and lectured extensively on legal issues relating to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and international criminal tribunals. Professor Orentlicker received a BA from Yale University and her JD from Columbia Law School. She testified at our first hearing of this subcommittee on genocide and the rule of law, and she's back again, and we appreciate that very much. Please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to provide testimony before this distinguished body again, which has, I join Gail Smith and others who've noted the extraordinary leadership your subcommittee has already provided. In the 1.5 years since its creation, I was, again with others who've noted this achievement, especially heartened by your leadership and success in introducing and then shepherding through to enactment the Genocide Accountability Act of 2001. Its entry into law was truly a landmark, and it significantly shrank the space for impunity for those who commit some of the worst crimes known to man. But as you noted in your opening remarks, it does not fully discharge our country's historic commitment to ensure that there's no safe haven to those who commit crimes of such savagery and staggering scope as to violate the conscience of humanity. And I mean in particular that it's not yet a crime, as you noted, to commit crimes against humanity under federal law. I think that Americans would be both surprised and disturbed if they understood this and understood what it meant. And I say this for two reasons in particular. One, you already noted. It was the United States, above all, that ensured that crimes against humanity were punishable at Nuremberg. I don't think without U.S. leadership we would have this as an enforceable crime. And as your opening video and your opening remarks noted, the United States has since then provided indispensable leadership in ensuring prosecution of crimes against humanity by various international tribunals as well as by other countries we've supported. The second reason, and so it's quite remarkable that we of all countries don't have a law on our books making it possible for us to prosecute this crime when perpetrators show up in our own territory. The second reason I think Americans would be concerned has to do with what crimes against humanity are. And here what I have in mind is I think that many people assume, and unfortunately incorrectly, that federal law already criminalizes mass episodes of extermination. And that's because, as you know, federal law already criminalizes genocide. There's a widespread belief, and it is not accurate, that genocide is a crime that encompasses the worst episodes of mass atrocity that we know. And yet that's not true. And I want to give just two examples to illustrate why, as important as it is, our legislation on genocide doesn't do all that it needs to do. First of all, when we ask people to think about the worst atrocities that they can think of or that happened in recent decades or memory, everybody's short list includes the notorious atrocities of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s in Cambodia. The estimates vary, but at least a fifth of the population of the country were wiped out during that period of just staggering, mindless, unspeakable atrocities. And yet, there's now a court that's been established jointly between the government of Cambodia and the United Nations to prosecute surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge. When the prosecutors handed down their first indictments, their first very historic indictments against surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge, they didn't include genocide in the charge. That could change as further indictments come forward, but the point will not change. The prosecutors were not confident that they could make out a case of genocide, even for this episode. The principal reason it's so difficult to make out a charge of genocide has to do with the very narrow and rigorous legal requirement of a specific intention on the part of a perpetrator to destroy a particular community as such. And again, if I could just illustrate how challenging and daunting it is for a prosecutor to make out this case. Let me give you one example. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia convicted in 2006 one of the most senior leaders of Bosnian Serbs, found him responsible personally for the killing of thousands of Muslims and Croats in Bosnia during the period of the worst carnage in Bosnia in the 1990s. They even found that the crimes deliberately targeted Muslims and Croats. Despite these findings, the court was unable to find that the defendant had genocidal intent. There was, however, a charge that fit this crime, and that was crimes against humanity. And so, again, the point is clear. If we want to be in a position to deter those who commit the most atrocious crimes we see, it's desperately important that we make it a crime under federal law to commit crimes against humanity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Arntlicker. Our fourth witness today is Joey Cheek, co-founder and president of Team Darfur, an international coalition of athletes committed to raising awareness about and bringing an end to this crisis. You're going to remember his name when I tell you a little bit more about him. Mr. Cheek represented the United States as a member of the men's speed skating team at the 2006 Olympics, and after winning gold in the 500-meter race and silver in the 1,000-meter race, he donated the $40,000 award to Right to Play, an international aid organization focused on bringing the benefits of sport and play to the most disadvantaged children in the world. Time magazine named Mr. Cheek one of their 100 people who shape our world. He's currently a student at Princeton University, and I thank him for being with us today and invite you to testify.
Thank you. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Coburn, and honorable members of the committee, it is my pleasure and an honor to be asked to submit a brief testimony on such a weighty issue as human rights and accountability. I'm certainly not an expert on the legal intricacies of international accountability. I'm simply a student and an athlete, but in those positions, I've had experiences that I feel are unique. In 2006, after 17 years of preparation, I became the Olympic champion in my chosen sport of speed skating. After spending years traveling around the world as an athlete representing the United States, my eyes opened to a tragedy that was occurring in a part of the world that I felt was vastly underreported in my home country. That tragedy was the mass killings occurring in Darfur, Sudan. For more than 2 years now, I've continued to try and raise awareness about the horrible atrocities faced by so many innocents in Darfur. I founded a coalition, Team Darfur, to bring together like-minded athletes to bring awareness to the abuses that are occurring. I've spoken in front of groups of thousands, and I've traveled to Chad to visit firsthand with refugees driven from their homes in Darfur. Like all of us here today, I'm appalled by the suffering that these innocents have gone through. The numbers of people killed in Darfur is as massive as the worst of natural disasters. However, unlike the loss of life and home that occur when natural disasters strike, these vicious crimes are the result of conscious and willful effort by a group of people. Over the last 5 years in the deserts of Darfur, almost every day, men make the decision to aim a gun at the head of an innocent and pull the trigger. They make the decision when they storm into a village to rape women over and over again. And then they make the decision to burn that village to the ground and drive every living thing out into the desert to starve to death. In Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, decisions are being made every day that are every bit as vile as those made in the field. Officials of the government empower these savage acts on men, women, and children. They arm these militias. As Dow would say, they pay these militiamen to slaughter innocents, and they use military aircraft to bomb civilians. Men there make the decision that they can destroy a group of people simply because they do not want them around. When I first became aware of Darfur, my intention was only to try and raise a bit of awareness and perhaps raise a little bit of money for relief. And I thought that once people knew what was happening throughout the world in this region, that this crisis would somehow magically stop. What I've come to realize is that it takes much more than awareness. In the face of crimes such as these, people must be willing to fight back. We must be willing to fight back. And that doesn't always mean picking up a gun and charging into the fray, but using every available tool at your disposal to bring these murderers and rapists to justice. The situation in Darfur was complex and has become increasingly so, but complexity cannot conceal the fact that throughout this conflict, men have consistently made the decision to indiscriminately take the lives of huge numbers of innocent people. For that decision, there must be accountability. There must be the knowledge throughout the world that if you willfully destroy the lives and homes of innocents, you will be held responsible. I hope the Senate will follow up on the June 3rd letter to Secretary Rice to ensure that she directs the State Department to take advantage of the few remaining days of the U.S. presidency of the UN Security Council to advocate for expanded UN sanctions against the Sudanese regime. The U.S. has, of course, been a leader in using sanctions as a method of accountability for the perpetrators of this genocide, but we need to ask the rest of the international community to join us in implementing these important measures. After hearing the stories of refugees from Darfur, people have had to flee their lives because of the decisions these individuals made to rape and murder. I know there are more than the few people now listed on the Treasury Department's list who are responsible for these crimes. I hope the Senate will request that the administration expand the list of specially designated nationals to include all parties responsible for the atrocities, most particularly those at the highest levels of the Sudanese government. Respected individuals from around the world are working tirelessly to ensure that perpetrators of the crime in Darfur are held accountable. What I and other athletes who make up Team Darfur hope to do is to call upon the international community to observe an Olympic truce period for Darfur. The Olympic truce originated in ancient Greece, but in recent history, world leaders have invoked the truce as an opportunity for the international community to expend exceptional effort, as athletes do when they're striving for medals, to create and promote peace. An Olympic truce for Darfur would only be possible with increased deployment of UN peacekeeping force and a rejuvenated peace process that has the full support of permanent members of the UN Security Council. If this Olympic truce period is marked by an increased effort by the international community to secure peace for the people of Darfur, the measures of accountability that this committee hopes to pursue, I believe, can be more possible and more effective. I was raised to believe that we live in a nation that values justice. I've seen that belief validated time and time again, and I'm proud of the work that we as a nation have done to help the innocents of Darfur. As we all know, there's much more that we need to do. We must continue to lead the international community to bring justice to the criminals that continue to perpetrate this violence. In doing so, we'll not only help the hundreds of thousands of innocent people still living in Darfur, but we'll move one step closer to a place where men will know that they face consequences for committing these crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheek. Without objection, we will enter into the record a statement from the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Patrick Leahy, and I might just say, as I have before, who graciously allowed the creation of this subcommittee, the first subcommittee, to our knowledge, in the history of Congress dedicated to human rights and the law. We also will enter statements from organizations and individuals, including the Armenian Assembly of America, Armenian National Committee of America, Center for Justice and Accountability, Human Rights First, Human Rights Watch, and Save Darfur Coalition. And without objection, they will be entered into the record. Mr. Hari, I'm going to start my questioning by asking you what may be an obvious question. As I spoke to President Bush in several meetings about peacekeeping force and the need for us to bring in some outsiders to try to bring peace to your country, I told him that it was my feeling that Khartoum would resist every step of the way, would find as many obstacles as possible to stop the United Nations or African Union or any other force from actually coming in on the ground and supervising or trying to take control of this vast territory, which, as you say in your book, is as large as France or Texas. Do you have the same impression from your experience in watching the government of Khartoum? Is there any hope there that they will open the country to any kind of international participation?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I think if there is any pressure from international community to the Sudanese government, they will have to accept it. And since I came here in the United States, the Sudanese government sometimes we say we will accept the peacekeeper from Security Council. Sometimes they were denied because they were playing a game with international community because they being covered by the Chinese the veto in Security Council, but it does if the people United States working more with the Chinese government and the Arab leagues, they have to put pressure more for the government of Sudan. They have to accept it. I knew that what is happening in Darfur, the government of Sudan, he knew that if there is any international peacekeeper in Darfur, especially from Europe and United States, and the other country have experiences for this, there is too many responsibility from their government people who were attempting the crimes. So it may be holding, will be going to international court one day. So that's why they were delaying to accept some, and they denied sometimes. The African peacekeeper, we have it in Darfur, 7,000. As you know, the senators, I work with them 3 times in African Union. They don't able to defend themselves. How can 7,000 they have to keep a peace for the land is bigger than France?
Yes. Now, you have seen the refugee camps in Chad. You have seen what's happened to people, the Darfurians, who have been forced out of their country. Can you describe the living conditions of those who have been forced to leave?
I myself lived for 13 camps in Chad for 3 years where I was staying, I would be visiting. The life of our living in camps in eastern Chad is very hard sometimes. I was remember is Gosbeda, when I was visiting Gosbeda with the journalists. The Gosbeda has been attacked by the Janjaweed who were coming from Sudan. These special camps called Gosbeda is inside the Chad from the Darfur borders more than 180 kilometers. So all this were the Janjaweed crossing, and they came to attack this camp. Since I was visiting there, is a...
So that, let me make sure it's clear. That's 100, you said 180 kilometer, which would be about 108, 110 miles, that the Janjaweed would come from Sudan and attack the refugees in the camps in Chad. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that exactly. About 115 or 110 to 15 miles from the Sudan, they were crossing to inside the Chad to attacking the camp. And at the same time, there's a U.S. ambassador visiting there. There's how the people will be very hard. The children, how they were very afraid. I was talking to my people that it's just only few days maybe from Gosbeda you can cross to Central Africa. And they were talking about what can we should do. We have to go to Central Africa, for example, from here to stay being safe. And I know there is Central African, the East Central Africa also were being attacked by the Janjaweeds, and who were being militated by the government of Sudan, and they were being coming in Chad. So we were wonders ourselves when we coming out from our land and we don't have a peace in Chad because there is no security. So it means there is no aid workers able to work in the refugees camp because there is no security.
I'm going to ask one last question before I give Senator Whitehouse an opportunity. And in your book, you described the attacks, and it seemed to me they came from so many different levels. The planes overhead dropping bombs, and you described the shrapnel as being pieces of old appliances that have been chewed up and put into these bomb casings and explode and kill people. The helicopters, the Janjaweed on horseback, on camels. But in your opening here, you talked about the child soldiers who are involved in this, and that was a subject to one of our earlier hearings. And I might just say for the record, I'm disappointed at this point that we don't have the support of the administration on our Child Soldiers Accountability Act, but we are working to try to achieve that before the end of the year. Tell us about these child soldiers that you've seen who were part of this devastation and genocide in Darfur. Are they the kinds of children who were stolen away from villages? Are they receiving money? Are they receiving drugs, as we've heard in other parts of Africa? Tell me, if you can, the conditions of these child soldiers.
As I mentioned in my book, the Senator, is when I was captured, mainly with by some rebels, which were being very loyalty for the government, which was be paid by the government. And those always my tribe also, they were speaking the same language. Yes, the Gawa. 2 children, me and my driver, they were taken us. They have orders already from their commanders. They have to shoot us inside the valley. When we are tying They were smoking a cigarette. They have a Kalashnikov. They were less than 14 years old. And both of them, they know me, as the families. And
They knew you.
yeah, they knew me. Back is my family. They know me as who is I am. And they were discussed over there, and they decided they don't want to shoot me. And I even asked them, don't shoot me if you don't tighten my eyes, if you don't tighten our eyes, because I don't want to see you are shooting me, because yes, I came yesterday from your family. I saw your mothers or your sisters in refugees camps. And one of them, they said, oh, we decide we don't want to shoot you, Dawood, because we knew you and we knew your family and you knew us. So if the commanders wanted to kill you, he have to kill you himself. But we used to kill for the prisoners. When it's the prisoner captured by the rebels, maybe if the people we don't know, we can shoot, but we can't shoot the person we know. I said, okay, even you are very children. You are a child, it's 14 years, you don't know anything about how to shoot the person. Why you have to shoot him? And they said they have orders from their commanders. For example, these people were the enemy for them, and they don't know, for example, Senator, they don't know these children, what is the international law. Supposed to be the world's prisoners being kept, even if that's who is from the Janjaweed or the government soldiers. But if they left with those children, they were very easily can kill them. They were very easy. They were telling me that you get in this area 1 cigarette to smoke is more harder than to shoot someone in this land. So we can do that's how we are living in Darfur.
Thank you very much. Senator Whitehouse.
Particularly how a criminal statute making it an American crime to commit a crime against humanity in a foreign country would work procedurally with respect to the trial itself and with respect to efforts to seize the defendant if either before trial or before he or she were convicted.
Well, first of all, a basic assumption of my testimony is that jurisdiction would be established only if the defendant were in the United States. We would have to have physical custody over that person. Unfortunately, it's not at all uncommon for perpetrators of very serious atrocities to elude detection when they come into the United States. An organization that works on this estimates that there are thousands of perpetrators of very serious atrocities. Some of them have come to a kind of justice when victims of their abuses run into them. They often live in the same communities as victims and are able to bring civil actions against them. But even when those actions are successful, often the perpetrator, that is even when a judgment is rendered of responsibility for atrocities, including crimes against humanity, the perpetrators can stay in the United States and not fear prosecution. So that's one part of it. We would have physical custody.
Would you be able to secure an indictment before somebody was in the country, or would the very beginning of jurisdiction, could you not even indict while somebody is abroad?
Excuse me. Normally, jurisdiction would be established when you find someone in the country, but I think it would be a mistake.
So indictment would have to follow. You wouldn't be able to indict someone.
Well, what I was going to say is I would think it desirable to frame the legislation in a way that allows the possibility of seeking the extradition in extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps I should say, I don't assume that the United States should be a forum of first resort for prosecution. The United States has long cooperated to ensure prosecution in other countries and should continue to do that. But there will be circumstances when this is the only place where someone who has committed atrocities that are beyond the pale can be seriously prosecuted. Now, once in a while, the example that shapes my answer to your second question is in 1997, Pol Pot, the notorious leader of the Khmer Rouge, was suddenly available for prosecution when his own forces rebelled against them. And the United States government wanted to bring him to justice and discovered that our own law didn't make it possible to prosecute him here. The administration at that time tried desperately to find another government that would prosecute Pol Pot and was unable to do so before he died a year later. In a circumstance like that, had the United States been able to seek his extradition to the United States and prosecute him here, we should have that authority. Those are exceptional circumstances, but I think it's desirable that U.S. law provide for that type of possibility.
Without that law presently, if it becomes known to the United States government that someone who has participated in crimes against humanity is passing through a United States airport or one way or another entering the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, is there anything that can be done other than to refuse entry?
We can't prosecute that person for crimes against humanity. We might be able to prosecute them depending on the nature of their offenses for torture. We have a statute that enables us to prosecute torture wherever it was committed. That particular statute has been on the books now for about 14 years, and there has so far been only one prosecution under that statute. But that would not begin to cover all of the kinds of crimes against humanity that are committed, such as enslavement and so forth, and generally would not capture the enormity of the crimes. So yes, we could deny them entry, we could try to remove people, but we don't have, even in our immigration laws, crimes against humanity as such as a basis for removal.
And would the idea be that the United States would exert its diplomatic pressure to try to expand this kind of jurisdiction and this kind of statute throughout the world so that people who engage in crimes against humanity find it increasingly difficult to find shelter in any other country?
Well, first of all, quite a few other countries do have crimes against humanity in their statutes and establish the possibility for exercising jurisdiction over perpetrators of crimes against humanity from other countries who come to their country.
Any examples of where it's been done?
It's been done in Germany, I believe Australia. Let me let that information percolate back up to my brain, but I'd happy to get back to you. And it's happened in quite a number of countries, and a lot of countries are now in the process of changing their laws so that they can prosecute crimes against humanity. The United States has provided quite important leadership in helping countries that are recovering from mass atrocities to strengthen their own ability to prosecute perpetrators. And so the type of leadership you described is already happening to some extent. What we, I apologize for repeating myself, but what we can't do is prosecute perpetrators here. And that's a problem in part because often we don't have a place we can extradite people to where they can be prosecuted. And that's for the most obvious reason. When crimes against humanity occur, almost by definition, the country where they occurred has descended into a state of wholesale collapse of the rule of law. And so if it's possible to send perpetrators back to the country where they perpetrated their crime, that would be ideal. The United States has helped countries in the former Yugoslavia to institute proceedings in a credible fashion, but that was possible only some years after the conflict ended, and it was possible for shattered judicial systems to begin to get back on their feet. So of course we should continue to do that, but we should always be able, when that's not possible, to prosecute perpetrators here. To me, it's scandalous and shameful that when we find people who've committed the most, staggering crimes our imaginations can conjure, and those we can't even begin to imagine, we prosecute them for visa fraud. To me, that's scandalous, and that really should end.
Well, I appreciate your testimony very much, and I look forward to working with you and the chairman on the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Feingold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing today, and thanks to the witnesses for testifying before this subcommittee on such an important issue. I'd like to make some quick comments and then turn to a couple of questions. Over the last century, a genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity have occurred too frequently in many cases because the will to stop these atrocities has been lacking or far too late in coming. Today, as we watch the genocide in Darfur continue to unfold, we are reminded that even though the international community has made great strides in addressing such atrocities through the law, there is still a long way to go to ensure that this legal framework is adequately developed and robustly implemented. I have long believed that the protection of basic human rights and accountability for human rights abuses must be a cornerstone of American foreign policy. The failure to prosecute those guilty of crimes against humanity makes it more likely that such crimes will be repeated. Accountability must be established in order to overcome long-entrenched cultures of impunity, stem the potential for violent retribution, create conditions for meaningful reconciliation, and ultimately prevent new rounds of atrocities from occurring. While we've made some progress in encouraging accountability for abuses of human rights, there are loopholes within our own legal framework here at home that allow individuals to find shelter from prosecution for their unspeakable actions. Now, in part because my colleagues have given such careful focus to Darfur during this hearing already, let me note one particular example in which the perpetrators of human rights abuses in other nations have found shelter on American soil. In 1980, 4 American churchwomen who had been working with refugees in El Salvador were brutally murdered by members of the Salvadoran National Guard. In command of these men were 2 Salvadoran generals who, although they bear direct responsibility for this atrocity, are currently living in the United States. In 2002, the generals were found liable in civil lawsuits for acts of torture carried out under their command, yet despite having been found liable for these terrible crimes, they continue to reside freely in Florida. Criminal prosecution of these men is hindered by the fact that the statute criminalizing acts of torture was not passed until 1994, long after these acts were committed. Our immigration laws, however, do allow the United States to deport these men. Inexplicably, the Department of Homeland Security has not initiated deportation despite repeated appeals from members of Congress. It is unacceptable that individuals who are known to be responsible for human rights abuses are allowed to find safe haven in the United States. I hope this hearing will help us find ways to hold these men and others like them accountable for their actions. Professor Ortlicker, is there any doubt in your mind that the United States law generally permits the prosecution of individuals for human rights violations like torture, which is prohibited by U.S. law, when those violations are committed by others acting under their direct command and control? And is there any doubt, if there is any doubt, does Congress need to step in and fix this problem?
There's no doubt in my mind that the torture statute that Congress enacted should be interpreted to cover people who exercised effective control over people who committed abuses and did not take the reasonable steps necessary to prevent or punish those abuses. Unfortunately, as you know, there seems to be some doubt on the part of the Department of Justice about whether they can enforce the torture statute under that theory. And so all I can say is I commend this subcommittee's leadership in pressing the Department of Justice to interpret the statute the way you see so. And if there is continued reluctance to interpret the torture statute that way, then I think it would make sense for Congress to amend the torture statute to make it explicitly clear that command responsibility is a basis for prosecuting. I mean, we all know that it's especially important to send a message to those who bear the highest levels of responsibility that they will be held to account if abuses occur that they were in a position to stop or which they directed. And there should be no doubt about our ability to do that.
Well, let me ask you then about these 2 Salvadoran generals who were found liable for torture yet are currently living in the U.S. As I'm sure you know, U.S. immigration law allows the Secretary of Homeland Security to deport someone if they are found to have, quote, committed, ordered, incited, assisted, or otherwise participated in either any act of torture or any extrajudicial killing, unquote. They may also be deported if the Secretary of State reasonably determines that their presence would have adverse foreign policy consequences and that they were inadmissible due to a crime of moral turpitude. In November 2007 and again of March 2008, my colleagues, Senator Durbin and Coburn, wrote to Secretary Chertoff asking him whether he planned to deport these generals. Both times they received the response that the Secretary is reviewing the facts of the case to determine whether deportation is appropriate. Given your knowledge of the case and the applicable law, is there any reason why it should have taken 7 months to decide whether non-citizens who have been found liable for acts of torture should be deported?
All I can say is it's mind-boggling. If I recall correctly, They've been in the United States for almost 20 years. The U.S. government has had long enough to figure out that these people do not, should not, under any understanding of any law, enjoy the privilege of lawful residence in this country.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Feingold. Mr. Sheik, I'd like you to explore with us a little bit more this concept of an Olympic truce. You are not calling for a boycott of the Olympic Games. Is that true?
Correct. Obviously, having been a participant in 2 Olympics, and really, I think my worldview having been shaped by the Olympic Games, and what an incredible experience it was for me. I still believe, as idealistic as it may sound, that the Olympics can be a great force for promoting for promoting peace and for promoting justice throughout the world. What we believe, and there's some historical precedent for it over the years, governments have called for a truce during the Olympic Games for different regions, either war-torn regions, to allow athletes to travel from those regions, or sometimes I believe. And again, I'd have to check to make sure, but I believe in '94 there was a brief peace called in Yugoslavia during crisis, or during some of the conflicts there, so that children could be immunized, and it was led by the IOC and signed off on by many members in the UN. What I would love to see happen, and what I think many athletes that I've spoken with believe is possible, is that if nations of the world, particularly members of the permanent members of the Security Council, were to try to enact something more than just a symbolic truce, but actually try and restart a peace process in which members of some of the rebel groups can perhaps be brought back to the table, or hopefully the most valuable thing is if there are some sort of concrete goals that can be realized, either deployment of more UNAMID troops, or fulfillment of some of the UN security resolutions already passed.
You're a student at Princeton, and yet I know you've traveled to many campuses talking about Team Darfur and what your goals are. Would you like to give me your observations about why this genocide in Darfur seems to resonate among the young people of our country?
I can speak for myself pretty much. I think only in that I think that we are I think we're offended by the thought that there are such huge numbers of people being slaughtered by their own government, and we're all aware of it. I think perhaps in crimes in the past, it was all dependent on whether one journalist could sneak in and get a few images out. And I think today, students across the U.S. are so well connected with events going on around the world, within just a few seconds of hearing something about a crime that's happening halfway across the world in a country that we have no strategic interest in, we can be aware of the massive injustice. And I think it offends us that we can be aware of this, and that this can happen, and that people in power can know this is happening, and yet still seemingly little is done to stop it. Again, I understand the complexities of the issue, but I think more than anything, the ability that we have to reach out, see the world, and realize that we have the ability to stop these crimes, and we haven't.
Ms. Smith, most everyone knows that Sudan is an oil-producing country, and that China is one of the major countries doing business with Sudan. There's been a lot of conversation about how to persuade China to take a more active role in dealing with the Sudanese government. Can you give me your impressions as to whether or not we can, should, or will effectively work in that direction?
Yes, I think we can and should. Oh, thank you. I think we can and should, and there's been some effort, arguably more by the public than by our own government, to put pressure on the Chinese. And it's quite interesting. It's less pressure aimed at impugning their character or isolating China, and more pressure designed to call on China to use its leverage with Khartoum to, for example, allow the full deployment of the UNAMID peacekeeping operation. It's certainly not been successful, but I think there is evidence that it has had some impact. And I think it's evident in a couple of ways. One, a lot of the pressure around the Olympics and the reference to things like the Darfur Olympics is something that has resonated with the Chinese. They're just like anyone else. They don't want to be seen, particularly at a time that they're hosting the Olympics, as championing the cause of genocide. Second, I have, and many others of us in a growing movement have actually met with the Chinese on this. And I would say that, again, I don't know whether the pressure is sufficient to cause them to change their policy. I certainly don't think they're going to abandon Sudan and the oil supplies that it offers. But I had every indication that they're hearing this and they want to figure ways to get out from under the pressure. Unfortunately, what they've done has been insufficient. They've sent an envoy. They have made statements. They have been largely superficial gestures. Just recently, they commended the government of Sudan for its excellent behavior and progress on Darfur, rather ironically. But I believe that if there were united public pressure, and if the administration acted on this in some way, and frankly there's been very little, there have been a couple of meetings with the Chinese and I think that's it, that it might be possible to get the Chinese to use their leverage on Khartoum.
I might say that, as I mentioned earlier, that I've had conversations with Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, as well as the President personally on this issue, and I've reminded them that they've said not on my watch and that their watch is about to end.
Yeah.
Without a UN peacekeeping force in place and with the violence continuing. And so I'm hoping that in the closing months, even in the closing weeks before the Olympics, that they might be persuaded to renew this conversation with the Chinese and their role. Mr. Howery, one of the things you've said here, though, makes this especially challenging because you've suggested there are 28 different rebel groups now involved in the violence in Darfur and 3 different Janjaweed militia. We tend to oversimplify it here in the United States and say, well, if the government in Khartoum would just declare an end to this violence, it would end. But it seems to me that it's much more complicated on the ground in terms of who is in charge and who would be brought to the table if we are to find a truce or peace. Is that your impression too?
Yes. Yes. We are in Sudan, as Mrs. Simmons, she said, it is a very large country. When we had a war in South Sudan for 25 years, senators, after just only we have a SPLM, at that time Sudan People Liberation Army, but the Khartoum regime, so they able to split that power for many factions in South Sudan. They become that very weak. So that's what they used, the policy they did in Darfur for 28 different rebel groups. It's mainly by the tribals. They have to pay for some tribes or the tribal leaders, and they're fighting sometimes against some of tribe, and that's what they will support. But they wanted to make very weak for the Darfurians to be united themselves. But that is not going to be is for long, because you don't know right now if you are going to visit Sudan one day and you're going to Khartoum from Darfur. It's very easily the government of Sudan is telling you, look, what is happening in Darfur. It's not, there's no government troops, there is no any Janjaweed, yes, only there is tribal will be fighting themselves. So this is the ethnic problem, it's not the policy problem. So that's what they use. They make a different level of our problem in Darfur. That's how to make attention. It's different attention for international community, but that's the same problem. The government who is paying for the tribal leaders and the others different or rebel leaders to do that.
Professor Orntlicher, now what Senator Feingold asked was, I thought, a legitimate question about how many of these people who might be charged with crimes against humanity came to the United States, whether they answered the questionnaires honestly in order to come to the United States, and I think he addressed part of that in his question. Secondly, whether they could stay in the United States or be subject to deportation, as we've called on in several instances. But I'd like you to address a comment which I've heard when we suggest adding new crimes to be prosecuted, that we shouldn't be tying up our system of justice. We should deport them back to their country for prosecution. Could you address that particular critique?
Well, we should do all we can to ensure that people can be prosecuted in the country where they committed crimes when there's a credible prospect that they will be prosecuted. That should always be our first priority. But often removing someone is equivalent to guaranteeing their impunity. In some instances, when a country is still very unstable, if you send some of the worst perpetrators back and the system of justice is in a state of wholesale collapse, there's a risk of destabilization. So a decision has to be made on a case-by-case basis of where the best place for prosecution is, but we should always have the option of ensuring justice when it cannot be obtained elsewhere.
And for the record, I think this relates to a question from Senator Whitehouse. We looked up earlier testimony from David Scheffler about this question of crimes against humanity. This has been defined and incorporated in the criminal codes of Australia, Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, South Africa, Spain, Argentina, and the United Kingdom.
Right.
So other countries have seen the need to do what we are proposing here, and many of those have been our allies in wars against inhumane and terrorist conduct. Well, I want to thank this panel for their testimony here today, for bringing this issue forward. I've tried through the subcommittee and on the floor to continue to revisit this issue. I'm reminded of the experience of my former college classmate and former president, Bill Clinton, who after the genocide in Rwanda said when his presidency had ended it was one of the real mistakes of his administration, that they did not step forward. At the time, there were several leaders in the Senate calling for his administration to do something, including my predecessor, Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, and Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont, then a Republican. So it was a bipartisan effort which did not work. And so I felt that there's a need to continue to bring this issue forward in practical ways. And I've said from the outset that this subcommittee is going to focus on legislation, not lamentation. We are going to not just look in horror at the scenes of genocide and crimes against humanity, but think of practical ways for us to deal with them, to reduce the violence and to end the killing. And that is why this hearing has been held today. I'm going to give special thanks as I close this hearing to some extraordinary staff people who have done great work to make this hearing a possibility, starting with my staff attorney on Senate Judiciary, Joe Zogby, Eloisa Griggs, Jardeep Dargan, Corey Clyburn, who is a legal intern, and Talia Dubovy. And I also want to thank, on the other side, Senator Coburn's staffer, Brooke Basek, and in particular, his chief counsel, who's been very supportive and very helpful. Senator Coburn has been an excellent ally in this entire endeavor. I know he regrets not being able to be with us today, but I'm glad that he persuaded Senator Specter to join from the Republican side. As you can tell, there's a bipartisan interest in this. So at this point, the record will be open for questions to be asked of the witnesses for several days, and I hope they can respond in a timely way. I thank you all for the sacrifice of coming here today and being part of this testimony, and we will continue to press forward for this legislation. This meeting of the subcommittee will stand adjourned.